Be honest. What would you do if a raggedy kid, shivering in the freezing cold, held out his only gold necklace just for a single pastry? In that split second, would you call the cops, or would you open your door? Sophie's choice in those 10 seconds did more than just feed a hungry child. When she flipped that necklace over, she froze. A message engraved on the back had been buried for 5 years. This boy wasn't a stranger. He was the final piece of the puzzle directly linked to her son's death. As the brutal truth bleeds out, Sophie faces a gut-wrenching question. Is she truly saving a child, or is she desperately trying to fix a past that can't be changed? Don't blink, because the secret at the very end will redefine everything. You know about forgiveness? That morning the wind was cutting through the streets like a knife. A boy stood in front of the bakery, oversized jacket, frayed sleeves, mismatched shoes. He had his collar pulled up, hands buried deep in his pockets, trying to catch a spark of warmth. His face was smudged with dirt. His eyes were bloodshot from the cold. But in his hand something caught the light. A gold necklace. A simple, worn-out crucifix. And on the back, it was engraved, "Luke, always come home, ma'am. I don't have any money, but can I trade this for a bun?" His voice was barely a whisper. Sophie had to lean in, and then she saw his hands. Blue from the cold, dirt under the fingernails. But the way he held that necklace, like it was the only treasure left in the world, Sophie stopped dead. She looked at the boy, then at the gold in his palm. The contrast was heartbreaking. Her fingers brushed the pendant. The shop light hit the faded words, "Luke, always come home." Sophie's heart sank. The name Luke was exactly like her son's. And underneath a tiny worn-out address, 24 Maple. She shook her head, telling herself it was just a cruel coincidence. But a voice in her head whispered, "Is this a sign?" She frowned, caught between shock and suspicion. How does a kid like this end up with something so valuable? Is it even real? The boy saw her face and panicked. He flinched, but kept his hand outstretched like if she didn't take it, he was out of options. "It's real, ma'am. Belongs to my dad. I didn't steal it. I promise. It's not a toy." His voice didn't just crack from the cold. It's cracked from a wounded sense of pride. A priceless heirloom offered by a kid who didn't even have a decent pair of shoes. Yet he kept it spotless. No scratches. No scratches. No dirt. Sophie looked at his face smudged, but his eyes were impossibly clear. She hesitated. That name, Luke. Her hand froze. It wasn't just because she knew the name. It was the way he held it like. He was clinging to the last place he was ever allowed to call home. She didn't ask another question. She just pushed a pastry toward him, gently but firmly. "This isn't for trade. That's a memory. Pastries. I make those to be eaten, especially when you're hungry." The boy didn't say a word. He carefully tucked the necklace back inside his tattered coat, as if he were folding away the only photograph he had left. He took the pastry with trembling hands. The first bite was desperate, crumbs falling onto his jacket. He chewed so fast he almost choked, washing it down with a glass of water. It wasn't just hunger. It was fear that if he didn't eat it now, someone would snatch it away. Sophie just watched, saying nothing. She turned back to the counter, clenching her hands until her knuckles turned white, so no one would see her shaking. The next morning, he was back. Same old coat, same torn shoes, shoulders hunched. No necklace this time. Just a quiet, grateful, and slightly confused look in his eyes. He hovered at the doorway, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was still welcome. After a long moment, he shuffled toward the counter, his hands hidden in his pockets, as if his whole body were apologizing for being there. "I just wanted some water." No more words were needed. Sophie turned away and came back with a glass. And right next to it, it's a fresh pastry. Not because of pity, not because of charity. It was something about the way he stood there. She just couldn't turn her back on him. That kid had no idea. That one small pastry was the moment his life started to shift. And Sophie had no idea that by trying to save a stranger, she was actually salvaging her own heart. Before we dive deeper into this journey, hit that like button if you believe kindness starts with the smallest things. And if you think a single pastry can change a destiny, wait until you hear what happened when he showed up the third time. He kept coming back. Every day, 7:15 a.m. sharp. He never ordered. He never asked for more. He never asked for the price. He just sat in the corner by the window where the morning light barely reached. In front of him was a glass of water and a pastry Sophie had already set out. Some days it was a muffin. Others, a warm, buttery croissant. She didn't ask. He didn't tell. Every morning they passed each other like two people who knew each other too well for hello. Quiet, rhythmic, almost sacred. But little did Sophie know that silence was a mask for a truth neither of them was ready to face. A truth that could change everything, if only she was brave enough to look. You see, inside that silence, they were both holding their breath. The boy lived in a constant state of fragile hope. He was terrified his luck would just run out. To him, if he was even 60 seconds late, that pastry might vanish. Every time he stepped inside, his chest tightened. He'd scan the room, eyes darting, trying to see if he was still allowed to exist in that corner seat. And Sophie. She never asked his name, never pried into his past. But sometimes, when their eyes met, she saw something he was too scared to say out loud, and her heart would just sink. She got it. She knew that for kids on the street, hunger isn't the scariest thing. It's being dragged into the light where adults start poking, prodding, and judging. She thought to herself, if a single pastry every morning is what keeps him here safe, uninterrogated, then I'll let that silence be his armor. So she just kept baking. No questions. No changes. Until the day her sister saw him. She pulled Sophie aside, whispering with a sharp edge in her voice, "Are you seriously just feeding this kid for free? How long can you keep this up? Think about the ingredients, the labor. Look at him. Sophie customers aren't going to want to come back if they have to see that every morning." Sophie didn't snap. She just took a slow, deep breath and looked her sister dead in the eyes. Her voice was low, steady, and unshakable. "We were hungry once. Do you remember? We stood in front of those markets behind those food trucks, and nobody gave us a damn thing. Maybe you were too young to remember. I haven't forgotten the day I had to scavenge through a dumpster behind the market just to find a scrap of food. I'll never forget the way people looked at us, like we weren't even human." Her sister went dead silent. She didn't say another word. But for the first time, the look in her eyes wasn't judgment, it was a haunted realization. Like she was finally remembering something she had desperately tried to bury. The next morning, Sophie was up even earlier than usual. She baked. But this time, she picked the most perfect pastry in the batch. She wrapped it in patterned wax paper, tied it with a small forest green ribbon, and set it on that corner table before 7:15 a.m. Everyone in the shop saw it. One employee started to say something, then thought better of it. A regular customer shook their head slightly, but looked away. Nobody spoke up. But nobody tried to stop her either, because sometimes kindness doesn't need a vote. Sometimes just not breaking the silence is enough. But what happens when that silence finally cracks? Then came the rain, a downpour. It was the kind of cold that feels like needles piercing through your clothes. The boy, still nameless, was sitting outside, hunched over. He held a soaking wet book in one hand, trying to wipe the pages with his sleeve, but it was useless. His hair was matted to his forehead. One of his shoes was literally falling apart at the sole. Sophie saw him through the fogged glass. She didn't say a word. She just ripped off her apron, and for the first time in years, she ran out into the rain. No umbrella for herself, no coat, just a small parasol and a warm, buttery almond croissant. She propped the parasol over his chair, set the pastry on the table. No words, no eye contact. She didn't even look back. But then she remembered something. She ran back behind the counter and dug through an old bin. Her hand stopped on something soft. A charcoal gray knit beanie. It was a bit old, but clean, and it still smelled like home. That was the hat her son wore? During his very last winter, it wasn't store-bought. Sophie had knitted every single stitch herself after her son told her, "Mom, I want something warm, ... soft, like one of your hugs." She placed it next to the plate. No pressure, no explanation. Then she slipped back inside, outside. The boy stared at the pastry, the parasol, and the hat. His face was still frozen from the cold, but his eyes, they were bloodshot and brimming with tears. He sat down. He didn't eat right away. He just bowed, his head low, like for the first time in his life. Someone had finally believed in him, no strings attached. And then slowly, he started to eat, one bite at a time, desperate yet cautious. By the third bite, he coughed. He was choking because he was trying to swallow it all too fast. Sophie had already set a glass of water next to him. He took a huge gulp, like he was terrified that beautiful pastry would vanish before he even had a chance to taste it. Before he left a small, neatly folded napkin on the table. Sophie opened it. There was just one line, scribbled in pencil. "My name is Noah." That name made her heart skip a beat. Not because it was special, but because, finally, in a world full of jagged edges and cold shoulders, this boy had let her take one step closer. The next day, when people saw Sophie handing out pastries for free, an older man shook his head and barked, "Feeding that kid for nothing. How are you going to pay the rent on this place?" Rumors spread like wildfire. On the local community page, someone posted a photo of the shop with a caption, "Is this tiny bakery actually doing charity, or is it just a cheap PR stunt?" Some regulars started ghosting the place. People would walk up to the door, peek inside, and then turn right back around. Sophie's sister didn't say anything, but you could see the anxiety written all over her face. She wasn't worried about Noah. She was worried because her sister was gambling with kindness, again the one thing this world rarely forgives. A young employee even whispered behind her back, "It's like she's trying to pay a debt to someone who isn't even alive anymore." Sophie never gave them an answer. But the people in the shop said that was the first time they ever saw Sophie's hands shake as she held her coffee. See? What most people didn't know was that Sophie had lost her only son in an accident. It was a rainy day too, and her little boy was waiting for her. But she never made it. That chair where Noah sat there used to be another child. It's just like him right there. A child Sophie couldn't save. She never got rid of that chair. Not because she liked the wood, but because, to Sophie, that was the place where all the apologies she never got to say were kept safe. Later, when Noah's dad told the full story, he said, "He told me he stood outside that bakery for a week, just watching through the glass, watching you wipe the tables, pour tea for customers, and hang that little flag behind the counter," he said. "Your eyes look just like his grandma's, the last person who ever cooked him a real meal before she passed away." But what Sophie didn't see coming was, the next day, Noah vanished, and she was left with a haunting question, ... If a boy disappears, once will he ever come back? One morning in December, no rain, no snow, just a biting, bone-chilling cold, the kind of cold where your breath is too shy to even show itself. 7:15 a.m. Nobody walked through the door. The bell chimed every time the wind pushed through. But it wasn't Noah. Sophie still put the pastry on the table. The corner seat by the window, his favorite crispy croissant with a light dusting of sugar on the edges. But this time, it just grew cold and nobody touched it by that afternoon. She quietly packed it up. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She just put it in a box and sealed Kate carefully, like she was still hoping it would be opened by the right person. The next day, still nothing. Then a week went by. Then to Noah vanished as if he had never existed. No phone number, no address, no clues, just a habit that refused to die. Sophie still set a pastry on that table at exactly 7:10 every single morning. She started to wonder, should I go look for him? But then she'd stop herself. She was scared. Scared that if she crossed that line of silence, Noah would never come back. Scared that there are some choices that a kid has to make for himself. One evening, as they were closing up, her sister said quietly, "You see, they always disappear, right when you start to care." Sophie didn't say a word. She just lightly squeezed the handle of the pastry box she was holding. She wasn't looking out the window anymore. She was looking inward. The next morning, that pastry was back on the table. Same corner, same spot. But this time, Sophie tucked a small scrap of paper under the plate. Just one line, handwritten. "If you ever come back, I'll still be here." But deep down, a question still haunted her. ... If a boy disappears once, will he ever truly return? Christmas Eve. The bakery closed early. The small street was silent under a thin blanket of snow and golden lights flickered in every window. Sophie was wiping down the tables when the TV in the corner caught her attention. Local news, a holiday segment. Letters to Santa, the wishes of the children in our town. The host opened a cream-colored envelope with messy, childish handwriting. His voice hitched after the very first line, and then he started to read slowly. "Dear Santa, I don't need any toys. I just need my dad to come home soon. And if you can, I want a mom just like the lady at the bakery. She never asks me questions, but she always makes sure I'm full before I leave. One day, when I was so cold, she even left a gray beanie next to my plate. She hangs a small American flag in the corner of her shop, just like the one my dad has in his room, I think. She understands people who have nobody, and she never makes me feel like I'm a charity case. If God is real, please don't let her be lonely on Christmas Eve." The kid who pretends to ask for water. The entire studio went dead silent. The host paused for a second, then folded the letter with both hands. On the screen, a hashtag flickered. Hashtag somebody feed hope. Hashtag somebody feed hope. Hashtag the baker from our town. No signature, no return address. But everyone in town knew only one place with a table by the window, where there was always a pastry waiting and, sometimes, a knit beanie. Sophie stood frozen by the window for a long time. Her hand was still clutching the rag. She used to wipe the tables, but her heart felt like someone had just reached in and touched it so gently. Right in the spot she thought had been frozen forever. The next morning, in front of the bakery door, someone had left a small paper bag. Inside was a traditional gingerbread man, covered in white icing, sitting on a forest green napkin. A handwritten note was taped to the bag. "For you, the mother this whole town is thinking about." Nobody in town said it out loud, but everyone knew where that letter came from and who it was for. But what Sophie didn't know was that letter traveled much further than she could imagine. And it wasn't just going to bring the boy back. It was going to bring back something nobody expected. Early morning, the bakery lights had just flickered on. The smell of rising dough hadn't even filled the kitchen yet when the door rattled. Then opened. The boy walked in. "My name is Noah. ... His voice was small but clear. A very ordinary name. But in that moment, Sophie felt her heart tightened, like she was hearing the name of something she had lost a long time ago. No more torn jacket. No more matted hair. Just a clean, neat little boy, but his eyes were the same eyes Sophie saw that first day. Hungry. But not for food. Following behind him was a man in military uniform. The dust of the road was still on the hem of his pants. His boots were stained from the journey, but his face was clean-shaven. His uniform was pressed flat, and his eyes, they held something that was both gripping tight and letting go. the kind of man who had walked through a battlefield but still kept something soft in his heart. He stepped inside and stood straight, in front of the counter right where Sophie was turning around. Pulling a fresh tray out of the oven, the sound of the metal hitting the countertop made her look up. 1 second, then 2. Total silence. The boy edged closer, looking up at Sophie and then at the pastry still steaming fresh off the rack. He didn't ask, he didn't beg, he didn't explain. He just stood there like he'd walked 1,000 miles just for the permission. To come back, the man placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then he turned to Sophie and bowed. "Lo, I'm David, Noah's father, and I don't even know where to start thanking you." Sophie didn't answer right away. She just looked at the pastry. A perfect croissant, golden and flaky, smelling like warm butter. It looked exactly like the ones from before, but this time, she knew it was so much more than a snack. But what made Sophie freeze was the way this father looked at her. Like he was about to spill a secret that only she was quiet enough to hear. The shop started to clear out. The bakery returned to that familiar hush. Just Sophie, the father, and the sound of dough rising in the oven. He stood there for a moment gathering the words he thought he'd never be able to say. Then he slowly sat down, resting his hand. On the edge of the old wooden table, his voice wasn't loud, but every word carried weight. "My wife left. Right after I was deployed, she took him with her. But then she dumped him on someone else. He lived with her new guy, but he wasn't. Treated like a son, he told me. The only meal he'd get was leftovers. And the worst part wasn't the hunger. It was the way that man looked at him like he didn't even exist. And his mother. She didn't call, didn't check in. She was too busy with her new baby." He paused. His eyes tracked the small clock on the wall, trying to keep himself from breaking down. One day he hopped a bus back to our old house. The house was locked, empty. He didn't tell me how bad it was. He just called me once and asked, "When are you coming home?" He knew. He knew I was in a combat zone and couldn't just leave. He didn't want to worry me, so he crashed at a friend's place, scavenged for food. He told me he even took bread from a dumpster behind a grocery store once. Eventually, he found an abandoned warehouse nearby, and that's where he slept every night. He turned to Sophie, his eyes finally meeting hers, now blurred with tears. He told me, "The light from your bakery window was the only thing that made him feel like he was home. He was too scared to come in at first. Damn. But then he saw that you didn't turn anyone away. So he tried, and ... he stayed." Sophie listened in silence, her heart tightening with every word. Her fingers brushed the military button pinned to her apron. David took a shaky breath, his voice cracking. "But there's something I've never dared to tell anyone, not even Noah. Our old house, 24 Maple Street. It's right next to where your son had his accident. We knew, my wife knew. And we chose to run away because we were scared, ashamed, and couldn't face the truth. I've been hiding from that reality for years, Sophie." Now Sophie understood. The pain in this man's eyes wasn't just for Noah. It was for a guilt he'd buried for a lifetime. David nodded, his eyes bloodshot. "Noah loves you like a second mother, and I know I haven't been the best father. I'm being deployed again soon overseas for a year, maybe longer. If you're willing, I want you to be Noah's legal guardian while I'm gone. I'll provide everything he needs." Sophie looked at the chair by the window where Luke used to sit and where Noah was standing now. She said yes, she'd get a second chance at being a mother, a chance to heal the hole in her heart. But it meant scaling back the bakery, maybe even closing parts of it to care for him. Her free bread program for the town's needy kids would take a hit. One child or many. Healing her own pain or continuing to serve the community. Her son died trying to help one person. Should she focus all her love on that one boy or keep her heart open for everyone else? He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, folded and refolded so many times the edges were fraying. There were smudges on the corners, places where a kid's grip had been too tight for too long. He set it on the table. It's the letter he wrote to Santa. He never told a soul. I only found out when they aired it on the news. David's voice dropped, thick with a jagged kind of pain. He wasn't just asking for me to come home, he wrote. Please don't let me be abandoned ever again. David stopped, swallowing hard. And that's what kills me, Sophie. Because my unit just got deployment orders. I'm heading back overseas for at least a year. Another year. And my boy is going to be alone. Again. Sophie didn't say a word. She just stood up. She opened the oven and pulled out the first tray of cinnamon rolls. They were golden brown, glowing like morning sunlight. She set one on a plate. She didn't say a thing, but she placed it right in front of him. It wasn't just a pastry. It was a promise. From a woman who had once missed her chance with a child and was now deciding right then and there that she wouldn't let it happen a second time. Under the warm shop lights, Sophie looked at him. No words, but something inside her eyes finally broke. Not tears, but deep, raw empathy. A quiet ache, and a flicker of hope that had finally been relit. But what Sophie didn't know was that their story was about to be heard by the entire country in a way nobody saw coming. Late December, a small town in Ohio, the snow was dusted over the rooftops like powdered sugar. And it was so quiet you could hear a boot crunch from a block away. Sophie was just unlocking the bakery door when she heard the low rumble of engines stop for black. Military SUVs pulled up in a line. Doors swung open. Soldiers in full-dress uniforms stepped out, sharp, solemn. The man in the lead held a sealed wooden box and an American flag, folded into a perfect triangle. He walked up to the shop, stopped, right in front of her. His voice rang out through the biting air. We're from the 82nd Airborne Sergeant David's unit, Noah's father. We're here today to honor a woman who kept a promise that a soldier couldn't keep himself. A crowd started to gather. Neighbors, regulars, local news crews were already there. Red lights blinking on their cameras, mics reaching. Out through the snow, a young mom holding her son stepped up to the door. My boy heard that letter on the radio. That night, he refused to go to sleep until he packed a box of his own toys to bring here. An old man left a bouquet of fresh flowers on the doorstep. A little girl, hiding behind her mom, left a paper cutout of a loaf of bread. The soldier opened the wooden box. He pulled out a challenge coin, engraved with the unit's name. Then the flag. And finally, a large letter signed by dozens of soldiers from the front lines. Thank you for being the home front we never thought we'd have. He set all three on the counter. The silence in the shop was suffocating. Then he turned, stood, at attention, and barked. Present. RMS. Every soldier there snapped a salute. The air was dead still, and then the crowd erupted. Someone was sobbing. Someone else was filming quietly, their hands shaking. Sophie stood behind the counter, clutching her rag. Her eyes didn't leak, but they were bloodshot. Inside, something finally settled. Something light, like the scent of baking bread drifting. Through the winter air. She stepped out front, standing beside the soldier who had led the salute. She nodded to each of them. Then she found her voice. If you boys aren't in a hurry, come inside. Today, ... Every pastry is a thank you. A young soldier blinked, then broke into a smile. The whole group filed into the shop like they were, finally returning to a place they had been promised. A reporter leaned in, asking Sophie, "Did you know that you've inspired the whole country?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She just smiled, then whispered low enough for only those closest to hear, I think. Anyone here would have done the same. Then she turned back to wipe the counter, already preparing for the next batch. That very morning, A new wooden sign appeared out front, where kindness is baked fresh every morning. On social media, hashtag the happy loaf started to trend. Then it spread, like a wildfire in a blizzard. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Because a boy who used to live in silence was finally about to speak, and not just with words. Sophie and David didn't need many words. It's just a quiet nod at dawn. One prepped the oven, one wiped the tables. Noah stood between them, flour on his hands, a quiet spark in his eyes. On his head was that charcoal gray beanie, a little too big, but clearly warm. It was the same hat Sophie had left by his plate on that freezing, rainy morning. A week later, the shop officially changed its name. No press conference, no big banners. Just a hand-carved sign by the door, the happy loaf underneath, in small chalk letters. Where kindness is baked fresh every morning. The local news reread that Christmas letter. Hours later, a regular customer came in and left a massive tip without saying a word. Someone else posted online, "I was wrong to call this a PR stunt. She's the real deal." The community started trickling back. No grand apologies, no noise, just more pastries being bought. More thank you notes left on napkins. People weren't just coming for the bread anymore. They brought boxes of toys, kids, clothes, handwritten envelopes. One old man left a note that said, "I used to be that hungry kid." A young mother wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that giving doesn't have to wait for a request." Then one day the man who had been the loudest critic walked back in. He stood silent at the counter, then placed a thick envelope on the table. "I was wrong," he muttered. "You reminded me of how my mom used to cook for the whole neighborhood during the winter. We went hungry." Sophie just smiled. A smile as light as the steam rising from the oven. A few weeks later, the shop launched a new program, the Paid Forward Loaf. A corner of the counter was reserved for pastries that customers could buy and leave behind. A small sign hung above it. "Take if you're hungry, give if you can." The biggest shock. The person running the program was Sophie's sister. The skeptic had become the heart of the charity corner every single morning. And that man who used to criticize them started bringing in children's books every week to place next to the bread. News of the happy loaf traveled further than anyone imagined. Bakeries in other states started hanging their own signs. "Take if you're hungry. Give if you can." On Instagram, thousands shared photos of their bread with the caption, "Inspired by hashtag, the happy loaf." That chair by the window, the one Sophie had kept for her son, was now Noah's spot. Every morning, he sat there quietly writing the labels for the bread. It was as if that old space had finally found a new breath. One morning, Noah asked, "Ma'am, can I write my own name on this one?" Sophie nodded. He wrote, "Baked by someone who was hungry. For someone who is hungry now." Noah pulled his gray beanie down a bit and sat up straight. His flour-dusted hands moved steadily as he wrote label after label, as if he were rewriting his own childhood with the warmest ink he'd ever known. Months later, Noah started school again. Sophie was the one to drop him off and pick him up every day. At first he was shy, but he eventually grew used to the sound of laughter on the playground. He made new friends, and sometimes they'd all head to the shop after school to help. Sophie packed boxes for the Paid Forward program. His favorite thing was telling his friends about where he lived, a little bakery that always smelled like butter and felt like home. On Sophie's apron sat that old military button. Nobody asked why, and right next to it was the crucifix necklace. Two things that seemed to have nothing in common. But to the people in town, they were proof that some wounds were healed by bread, by silence, and by simply being there. 1. Late afternoon, when the shop was quiet, David placed the necklace on the counter. "The day I enlisted, my mother gave this to me," he said softly. "She told me, keep it close to your hearts, so you'll always know you have a place to come back to. I passed it to my son when I didn't know if I'd ever make it back. To tell him myself. My mother said, someone ever gives my son a home, let that person keep this. You earned it. Sophie. Sophie didn't say a word. She just gave a small nod. Then she gently pinned the necklace next to the military button. In the corner of the shop, Noah watched them and smiled. His eyes weren't hungry anymore. They were finally at peace. A year later, Christmas. The town holds its very first event called the Day of Hope Bread. Everyone brings a pastry and a story to the happy loaf. Noah, a teenager now, still writes the labels every morning. But underneath each one, the names have changed. They used to be the names of the hungry. Now they're the names of the people giving back. That afternoon, after the crowds had faded, Noah sat down next to Sophie. He held a blank white label in his hand. He hesitated for a second, then turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, can I bake some pastries to give away? It's just like you did for me." Sophie didn't say a word. She just quietly handed him her old apron. And in that small kitchen, the two of them started baking the first batch for the next holiday season. If a stranger has ever done something kind for you, even the smallest gesture, tell us that story. In the comments, if you've ever been that hungry child or the woman who reached out her hand, we want to hear from you. And if any moment in the story touched your heart, whether it was Sophie's eyes, that chair in the corner, or the flour dusted, hands writing those labels, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Help us keep the fire burning for stories of kindness like this one. Let us know where you're watching from. And share your thoughts. What would you do if you met a kid like Noah today? Type bread in the comments if you believe that a single pastry placed in the right hands at the right time can save an entire childhood. And that one kind heart can light up an entire community.